All right. Hello, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos. Hopefully, everyone's having a great day today. Today is Tuesday, May the 26th. Hopefully, everyone had a nice extended holiday weekend. If you participated in any family activities and so on, I want to thank you for tuning in to our live stream today. And don't forget, we've started a couple different new social handles that you can follow the work with the Gadfly. So you can go over to Twitter, and our Twitter handle there is at the Gadfly MCN. And then also we started Facebook as well, just to, as we release more content, articles and things of that nature to share. And today, very excited today, I have Ken Shortgun Jr. of shotguneconomics.com with us, and also London Paul of the SeriousReport.com. So gentlemen, good afternoon. Paul, good evening. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And you?
Yeah, absolutely great. Ready to look forward to some discussion.
Well, it's very interesting. Over the weekend, this was brought to my attention. And if you think about the events unfolding and the current state of the matters of what's happening, we see that same old of where they never want to let any type of crisis go to waste. And we're seeing many agendas being formed with COVID-19. And one of which, and I titled this live stream, is kind of like the globalist last stand, if you will, and some of their attempts. And lo and behold, George Soros came out and he did an interview with Gregor Schmitz over on their site, which is Project Syndicate. And he talks a lot about globalism and just some of the concerns he has going on. I sent this to you both earlier today, and I'm sure you guys have some thoughts on this. And I'll open up if Ken or Paul, either one of you want to go first.
Go ahead, Paul, if you got some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's kind of, for me, we reach this situation where there's a lot of these people like Soros or lots of people of his ilk who are coming out going, things will never be the same again. And everyone panics and thinks that means, oh, it's the one world governance, it's the surveillance state, it's this, it's the, my rather crude analogy of we're all in a hamster wheel and it's AI kind of thing. And that's not what they're meaning in any way, shape or form. What they're actually, and straight from the outset, this Schmidt says to Soros, you've seen many crises, is this comparable? And he said, no, this is the crisis of my lifetime. But he makes an important statement here. Right from the start, he says, even before the pandemic hit, I realized we were in a revolutionary moment where what would be impossible or even inconceivable in normal times had become not only possible, but probably absolutely necessary. And then, of course, he says, well, then, of course, at the same time, COVID-19 happened, and that's disrupted people's lives, and it's created this unprecedented event. What he's actually admitting there is they knew the writing was on the wall, the game's up. The virus just added this whole level of complexity. Now, again, it's back to this, belief that, well, you either believe it's planned and they're going to roll out all this sequence of events, which I've never subscribed to and never will subscribe to. What he's basically saying is that we had major problems, and when that happened, that just threw another curveball in proceedings, and that's exactly where Soros finds itself. Now, okay, they then go on and say, well, could the crisis have been averted? And of course, they talk at some length about the implications of that, and Soros makes reference to the Spanish flu, and then talks about, all the uncertainty, and everyone will read lots of things into what Soros is saying and going, well, it's going to take a long time to develop a vaccine. And even if we've developed one, it could change every year because the virus will most likely change. And then we're going to have flu shots. So everyone will jump to the conclusion, oh, well, that's just an excuse to vaccinate everyone every year. And again, don't read too much into what Soros has said. Soros is not really anything of any significance. He likes to strut around in places thinking he's important and significant, and likes to gate crash events or try and jump on someone's coattails. But he's in his 90s now, and his day in the sun's long since gone. And that's another thing. Everyone automatically makes these assumptions that People like this are big players, and it may surprise people. He was never as big a player as people had imagined in that whole food chain. But I think that's, for me, is the interesting point is, and this is what they're all thinking. They knew that dollars day in the sun was over. They knew that big corporations in trouble. They knew it was the end of their empire because the dollar was going to, by the wayside, the ascendancy of China, Russia, all those things that we've discussed many, many times before. And he's admitting to that. And then, he then starts to talk about, obviously the problems with the virus. And then he makes this point where he gets asked, will this crisis change the nature of capitalism? And of course, Soros says, we'll not go back to where we were before the pandemic started. And of course, that will invoke in people's minds, oh, well, there you go. It's a pandemic. They planned this. This is just an excuse to roll out the next phase of what they're going to roll out. No, it isn't. What he's saying is, no, of course, things will never go back to the way they were because the US economy, Western economies were in free fall. The virus has accelerated that process. How things can ever go back to the way they were is impossible because we're in this state of huge change and huge flux. Whether the virus happened or didn't, we were always going to get to this point. And that's what effectively he's saying. So, of course, he talks about then, well, could nations come closer together? And then I'll park it there because I'll let Ken speak, obviously. But then there's something he talks about the US and China, which I think is important. But people see this in very different ways. And I can guarantee there'll be people who'll go, oh, there you go, that proves it. But it proves nothing. From my perspective, at least, it proves the exact opposite, that now they're in fear mode themselves. They don't know how to handle the situation. They don't know which way to go with this. And I'll mention something that's gone on in the UK with regards to the whole way they're handling the coronavirus, which bears out what I've said in recent weeks and months about how it was handled in the UK. But I'll let Ken speak now, obviously.
Yeah, I've been one who's believed pretty much from the start that while it is likely it originated in China, it was not done on purpose. And more, I come to the belief that it actually is affecting China politics, and just as much as it's affecting the West. And perhaps, Soros, yeah, he's a bag of wind. He did have his day in the sun when he shorted the British pound and then did the color revolutions, and that gave him enough gravitas to haunt the world stage even in his 90s today, even though he doesn't have as much power. He has made significant inroads though in buying politicians. There were a lot of elections, not just at the governor and the legislative levels in states, but many of them were receiving tons of money to get them over the top. For example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defeated the number 2 in the Democratic Party solely on money from Soros fronted corporations. But with that being said, his dream and that of globalism, what this COVID-19 epidemic, this creation of a epidemic has really done the opposite. It has made countries seal their borders. They're wary to work with other institutions. And even then, when Italy was in dire need of the EU to step in and show some leadership, the EU pretty much cut them off at the knees. So all of the institutions that the Soroses of the world and the bankers of the world tried to create for this globalist movement, they've proven themselves to be paper tigers. Case in point, we can talk about this a little bit later, but just came out today. The German central bank has finally said enough when it comes to what the ECB has been doing, and now the ECB says, "Well, we're going to go ahead and do our quantitative easing and our monetary policies outside, and we're going to just segregate the Bundesbank." Well, the Bundesbank was central, absolutely central for dealing with the sovereign debt of pretty much all of Europe during the Mario Draghi days. Now they're going to ditch the Bundesbank because Germany is suddenly telling the EU that what they're doing is illegal. What that's going to bring about rush the destruction of the euro, and even rush the destruction of the eurozone itself much faster than actually being a benefit towards increasing globalism. So it makes me wonder. We saw in January where pretty much this whole COVID-19 was downplayed by everybody. Then, by the middle of March, these same characters were changing their tune, and this is the worst crisis we've ever experienced. It's not even close. The reason that they suddenly did that is because they had 2 months to try to plan to use this crisis for their agenda and their benefit. And of course, it melted right at the same time that the global financial system was ready to collapse again. So really, it was just using it for their purpose, but it unto itself has never been a major crisis. It's being proved out here. Now that the numbers have come and the mortality rates are barely more than any type of severe flu season, as well as what the issue with using pseudoscience, i.e. lockdowns, i.e. wearing masks, pretty much meaningless for 99% of the population, but it served their purpose into trying to force people to have a mindset of we can't trust our leaders, they're incompetent, we've got to trust this ruling body. Well, the people don't trust anybody anymore, and so I think it's backfired all across the board.
Yeah, I think it's truly amazing when you look at Soros' efforts with his NGOs and how much he specifically finances and backs. I don't know if anyone will ever know, but you take a look at some of the events he's been able to orchestrate here in the United States, whether it's the Black Lives Matter or potentially maybe the Hong Kong protest on where these people are bused from. All these events unfold, and I think again with this last coming out of Soros in this interview, it's kind of like, hey, you know what? This may be our very last chance to try to get after this. And what's very interesting is he ties COVID in, and one of the questions it directly talks about, hey, related to the vaccine, and talks about, hey, we need to work with China, and he flat out says, well, I kind of disagree with that a little bit. Even though we need to work hard to protect our democratic and quote unquote open society. But he goes on to state that at the same time, we must find a way to cooperate on fighting climate change and the novel coronavirus. And I think it's because the wheels have kind of, essentially kind of fallen off the climate change, right? The carbon tax and all that kind of stuff. So I think he's, once again, trying to find a way of getting creative to, extend this conversation or extend the debate. You see how much we're kind of being divided into two camps right now with, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, stay at home, don't stay at home. And I think that, in part, I think that that's what Soros plays out, like, and through all his divide and conquer type things that he's done throughout his lifetime. So it's very interesting to see it come out now with this interview. I'm not sure how often he does it, but to speak, in part in regards to COVID and it's relating to, and he goes on, Ken, here in a minute, we can talk a little bit more about the EU, because I think he does chime in on that as well. But go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I was going to say with regards to the virus, I made the point recently that in the UK, I got the impression when they started to talk about removing the lockdown that the original models and everything massively over predicted what the outcome would be. And that was the basis, because originally the government in the UK said, let's just have herd immunity process. We'll have no lockdown. They got the stats. They went into blind panic mode and won't be better lock everything down. And now we find they're going to start opening schools for certain years on the 1st of June. And by the 15th of June, they're going to open all retail stores up again. So they're rapidly accelerating reopening everything, because, I mean, I don't think they're ever going to publicly go, well, hang on, we overreacted to this. But I think their actions will speak louder than anything they say. And it seems to me that they're just trying to get everything back to normal as quickly as possible. And I think it's a recognition that the basis of the models on which it was predicted 500,000 people would die in the UK and there'd be millions with the virus, just hasn't transpired. I mean, I'm not saying there hasn't, and no one's died. Of course, people have died, but you have to put this in relative context. But of course, based on those models, if they'd ignored them, and then subsequently that did happen, then they'd have been hung out to dry. So they're kind of damned in one sense if they did, and damned if they did potentially. But I think they're certainly moving in that direction that says it isn't as big a problem as we expected it to be, and therefore they're starting to relax things more and more. And I think the anticipation is assuming nothing untoward happens, that by sort of early July, practically everything will just be back to normal, except venues with venues with people attending, like sports events. Like obviously they're supposed to start what we call football, you call soccer season, is supposed to be finished, because obviously there was about quarter of the season left when they obviously abandoned it. So there's definitely an encouraging move in that regard, and again, it just bears out what I've said all along. The problem is everyone jumped to the conclusion that there was a great big plan behind it, but you could see by their actions and their behavior that they weren't acting like they had a clue how to deal with it. If you plan something, you'd know what to do, and all along they haven't known what to do. They've contradicted themselves, they've made mistakes, they've done things they should have done and haven't done things they should have done, etc. So this was no well-oiled machine to this. But here's the point: does anyone really genuinely imagine they could plan something involving over 100 countries and 7 billion people, and you think they have the coordination to be able to do something of that nature? When just look at our recent history, they couldn't organize anything. I mean, it comes back to my point: they're absolutely clueless and useless, and people should stop overemphasizing just how wonderful and great they are at what they've done. Their day of doing that is long over. That has been not the case for quite a long time, at least I would say the last 20 years. They've pretty much failed in everything they've tried, and that's because their empire was in collapse mode for a lot longer than people realized. But with regards to Soros's comments in China, I mean, and we will come to the EU because I think that's extremely interesting and important. But yeah, he makes the point where he has to get in the climate change nonsense and how, China and they should work on this vaccine. And then he goes, but I'm not in favor of working closely with China. And then, of course, it comes out, they're under a dictatorship, and Chinese people are angered by it, and apparently how they kept everything secret from the Chinese people, and Xi's grip on power is weakening, and of course he just rolls out all this propaganda, which is utter nonsense, because as I always said, the Chinese people didn't want Xi in power, or the CPC. They wouldn't be in power tomorrow. It would be the end. They would be gone rapidly. They only succeed because the vast majority of people believe in their government. Whether people in the West agree with that or don't agree is irrelevant. The vast majority of people are supportive of the government because they're doing things that have improved their lives. And then, of course, he goes on a bit about Trump, and frankly, who cares what Soros has to say about Trump? It's all predictable nonsense. But then he does make the point about the European Union, and of course we know why the big fear is the European Union. Because as I've said all along, if you look through history, the important things they've always tried to prevent is rapprochement and the development of relations between China and Russia. But more importantly, even than that, from their perspective in the European context, it's Germany and Russia. May surprise people, but Germany and Russia are natural allies. They should always have been glued together, but of course that's the one thing they didn't want to happen, because of course that would destroy the control over the European Union. The European Union was actually in its modern form a Bush construct. It is controlled by the US effectively. All this idea Britain controls the European Union, no, it doesn't. Well, the other classic one is the Rothschilds control the European Union. No, they don't. And by the way, the Rothschilds don't control central banks either. That's going to upset a few people, but it's true. Their grip on everything is long since gone. Yes, they had their day in the sun for quite a long time, but since World War II, they've been in decline also for an awful lot of reasons, which we don't have time to discuss today. But in terms of Germany, yeah, of course they're frightened, because as Ken rightly alludes to, Germany could end up breaking up the European Union. You've got Italy who could break up the European Union. Never mind the European banks themselves are all in serious trouble, as are the US banks, and it's going through the same economic crisis that the US, the UK is going through. And of course, not quite as bad as the US, but they've obviously got the printing presses going again. So, of course, they're absolutely terrified that if Germany walks away, well, there's only one direction Germany's going to walk away to, and that's east. And once Germany walks away and rotates east, and you get what I call the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing axis, then it's game over. Because Europe's always been the key battleground. That's why all the principal focus of the two world wars was Europe. The big focus was the breakup of all the old empires, which was the intended, one of the primary functions of World War I, as well as removing the Tsars from Germany for reasons we've discussed all this before. So let's not retread over old ground. So of course, yeah, they're naturally fearful, and if German courts are questioning the decisions of the European Court of Justice and the European Central Bank, well, we know that Hungary and Poland have been at loggerheads also with the European Commission over issues such as immigration, and in essence, they're starting to see that the wheels of the European Union's falling off, and therefore it's not surprising that Soros has come out and made statements and also trying to suggest, well, there's ways we can keep the European Union together. But one absolutely hilarious comment he comes out with, and predictable, was, well, yeah, the Commission President von der Leyen reckons they need about €1 trillion to fight this pandemic, but she should also add another $1 trillion for climate change.
What
a predictable statement.
I want to add something real quick to that. Your powder's spent and your capital is gone when you get Greta Thunberg as an expert for a roundtable to speak on the pandemic.
Well,
yes, absolutely.
One thing that's interesting, though, in terms of how they can, how easy this was to do this with this entire COVID-19 thing. If you think back, we remember the redacted Imperial College report that was used as a basis for all countries to form public policy in regards to COVID. And so how easy was that to just have one person do that, and then you just add the multiplier of the media to hype all that up and the fear, and boom, it didn't take a whole lot, which is just really pretty startling that it took one report and then the media to feed it that drove this whole policy, this entire lockdown. I mean, that's like what, 1-2 steps, it was done.
Well, if you carry over what that last quip I just did, people have been programmed to believe experts, to believe people with titles in front of their names. It says Fauci, he comes out, Dr. Fauci, 60 years as the head of this. Niels Ferguson, the scientific head, It's no different than a pastor. You walk into a church and the guy's got pastor in front of his name. People all just automatically have that knee-jerk reaction. Oh, they must know what they're talking about. They're close to God. It's the same thing with here. We are programmed to believe experts. And if you notice the media, every single time, or Governor Cuomo or anybody, we must listen to the experts. We're not going to do anything unless we're the experts. That's the way that they program people to go ahead and be willing to follow up to a point, and how they were able to implement this whole crap show to begin with.
Well, yeah, it's very true. I mean, look, as in a very trivial example, but I know from my own perspective, I mean, my academic career is of no relevance really anymore. I don't see any relevance to to using my title as a doctor, but I can tell you categorically that there's because obviously it's on some record, it's on information, and you'll get someone who'll speak to you and then they'll go blah blah blah, and then as soon as they see that, the whole attitude changes. Absolutely. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it does. So I've had that level of experience where they're all, and then you go, no, just call me Paul, that's my name. Like, oh, okay. And then that sort of helps to diffuse. But you do have this ridiculous obsession with titles in Western nations, or as you say, people perceive, you know, anyone with titles to be an expert in something, which absolutely isn't the case. And I mean, they maybe have some expertise in the field of whatever they've studied, but they generally extrapolate that. So that is a big point. But the problem is, yeah, everyone was making the judgment on the same basis. But it's one of those things, if I was in government and I get presented this data, I've got two choices. I either accept it with the inevitable consequences we're seeing now, but I could have rejected it and then found it turned out to be true, and I'm going to be out on my ear and have half of the nation coming after me with pitchforks saying you're responsible for massive death because you didn't act on this information. So you can kind of forgive governments in a way for going, well, we better do what's suggested because if it's that severe. And of course, they knew full well by that point that the economy was in big trouble. I mean, if you look around sort of mid-March time, the wheels were completely falling off, which is why we had all the problems we did around that time. And when obviously Powell came out on the Sunday, the 15th of March, and talking about slashing interest rates, and it was 750 billion in aid immediately. And of course, he came out because they were expecting major problems in that week, which they managed to circumvent for now, anyway, at least. So on that basis, when you stack everything up, they had no choice but to. This is why I said they were in blind panic mode. They were in blind panic mode because of what was happening economically. Then they're in blind panic mode that there's this virus that they've been told could cause very high fatality rates and people contracting it. They didn't know how to handle this. They didn't know what to do, and they certainly weren't, engineering some nefarious plan. And if you look at how all the things are stacking together now, it proves that's categorically the case.
Real quick, I'll add this because it was alluding to Xi Jinping whenever Soros was talking about China and referring to that. And we've heard a lot of conspiracies that the globalists and everything are moving from Europe and they're all going to China now, and China's playing a major role in the new world order. Well, I think this just pretty much puts that to rest, that with Soros saying that, hey, you know what, I'm not happy with him at all. But I just had to add that just for fun.
Well, yeah, but it's true, but it's a very valid point, because people keep imagining this case. The Chinese absolutely loathe, globalist cabal, call them what, they absolutely detest them, as do the Russians. They couldn't loathe them more. Why? Because they're constantly now trying to undermine their own nations. They've tried to overthrow Putin. They tried to do it with Xi. They've had failed assassination attempts on these two leaders, and we're supposed to believe that this is all just a game, because secretly China and Russia are just rotating the global governance to the east. China and Russia will never do that, and they would never have any intention of ever doing that. And all you have to do is understand Chinese and Russian history, apart from anything else, to realize that's, I'm sorry, frankly, utter nonsense. But again, it's another story that has all this gravitas in the alternative media, and it's become, in a lot of people's minds, established fact, when in fact everything proves to the contrary once again.
Ken, go ahead.
Oh, no, the thing that stands out to me is Paul's mentioned twice, they did not engineer this, but what they did is they attempted to rush in some sort of agenda plan in about a 2 or 3 month interim in between when they recognized it coming out and when they decided to have this implementation. And because it was done half-ass, go back to Ukraine, okay? The Ukraine coup actually was about a 3 to 5 year plan. Victoria Nuland mentioned we put $5 billion into Ukraine. Everything was planned up to that point, and then they did it right about when the Olympics were going to take place to try to make Russia become, on their heels and tear down their growing influence around the world. What they didn't expect is that half of the country didn't follow through with it, and the Donbass region, and they became a stalemate. The thing about it is where the CIA in the past would go down and beat up on little countries that really didn't have the organization to stand up to the major powers. You can't go after Russia. You can't go after China. You can't go after even Germany at that point with this type of thing, because they're just too powerful. You can't go up against the Syrias and the Libyas of the world and that are suddenly making strong partnerships with the other major powers. So what we saw coming out of the 70s and 80s and 90s and even aughts has pretty much come to a conclusion, and you're seeing the last ditch attempts by it. The Soros of the world has dedicated their entire lives towards building this new world order. They're not going to go quietly in the night, but as Paul mentioned, their influence is very, much less. They're a shadow, paper tiger, what they used to be. In the end, the question is going to be the people. Paul talked about the Chinese people. The reason that China hasn't fallen and Xi Jinping hasn't been in power, because the Chinese people on the mainland want that. Hong Kong people don't. They're still within the generation of getting their of being under British rule back in '99. They haven't had several generations of Chinese massive influence. They're still fighting it. Taiwan, of course, is being rebellious, but you know what? Taiwan's a puppet of the United States. That's no big deal. The two key that stand out to me is Germany and Japan. They've been vassal states going back to World War II. And even though they claim their independence pretty much under the auspices of NATO, and we know with Japan itself, they don't do any type of foreign policy without U.S. Assurances or U.S. direction. That itself is changing. And so if Germany is going to become autonomous and really decide to move into Russia's ballpark, which they appear to be doing more and more, you're going to see the end of NATO just by natural attrition. I think NATO is going to fall apart when the European Union collapses.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to go simultaneously. And when that happens, then Europe's a free-for-all, and they're going to have a choice with a declining power that has been dominant and aggressive, i.e. the United States, or somebody who's offering them the potential for true economic growth and to still hold on to their autonomy going forward into the future.
Yeah, let's jump into the EU, because the conversation was very interesting in this interview. Paul, do you want to break that down for us?
Yeah, he talks about, what role does the European play? He talks about all this power struggle, mentioning Trump and China and the US. And he makes a very interesting comment, Soros. Well, several interesting comments. The first one, he says, well, he's obviously concerned about the survival of the EU, because he says it's an incomplete union. He goes, it was in the process of being created, but that process was never completed. And of course, that makes Europe exceptionally vulnerable. He reckons, of course, it's more vulnerable than the US. And he makes the fact, one, because it's an incomplete union. What he's actually alluding to there is, from his perspective at least, and just because Soros thinks something doesn't make it so, or mean that it was ever going to happen, or anyone agrees with it, but he ultimately, what he's talking about, a complete union, is effectively the United States of Europe. He wanted to see the same way as you have the 50 states of the United States. He wanted to see exactly the same governance, etc., for all these European nations and consume all the European nations and make it, as I say, this what's so-called United States of Europe. Well, of course, he now knows that's never going to happen. And in fact, we've now got elements within the European Union who are getting quite rebellious in some ways. I mean, not only have we just highlighted Germany's issues with to do with the Supreme Court, effectively, who are now at loggerheads with the European Central Bank and the European Court of Justice over the fact of the ECB issuing bonds. But we've seen Austria are not happy about the issue of Corona bonds and how this old stimulus is going to be structured financially. You've got the Netherlands in the same thing. You've got Finland. So we know about Italy. We know that Greece has flirted with leaving, but of course that never came to pass. But Europe's very, very sort of broken and fractured in many different ways for geopolitical reasons, economic reasons, and a whole bunch of other reasons relating to nations on an individual basis who are finding fault with the European Union. Biggest split, of course, between being the southern states, the sort of Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and of course the northern states. So you've got like Germany, the Netherlands, France, you can include Austria and that, etc. So that's what he's alluding to. So he sees that, well, we never completed the European project. From his perspective, therefore, it makes Europe extremely vulnerable. And of course, the issue of Germany's, constitutional court, should I say, not Supreme Court, which made this ruling on the European Central Bank. Now, of course, that will frighten him greatly, because when he sees Germany being defiant, Germany's always been the one, contrary to conventional wisdom, that Germany controlled Europe and was dictating it, dominating it. It wasn't. Germany is always, as Ken said, and I've said many times before, has always been a vassal state of the US since the end, as Ken rightly says, World War II. So he talks about, then interestingly, he says, when Germany joined the EU, it committed itself to abide by European law. So he's going, hang on a minute, all of a sudden, Germany, if the German court can question decisions, which they have at the European Court of Justice, then he's going, well, we know Hungary have had disagreements, Poland have, or maybe Italy will, and it goes, the whole question of abiding by European law could go out the window, and all these nations could say, well, we're not abiding by this European edict anymore, and we're not, and we're not. So therefore, he sees the European Union as it exists now, that the writing's on the wall, which of course it most certainly is, and this should be no surprise. But he's in a roundabout way acknowledging the fact that the European Union is no longer going to be what he envisaged it would be, even though that was never going to be a reality. And then he kind of offers, well, I think, instead of issuing these Corona bonds, we should issue perpetual bonds. And there's no point going into that, because that doesn't really add anything of substance. But, he's kind of trying to think, well, in the one hand, Germany can't challenge this, but well, they are, and what is the consequences if they refuse to back down over this matter? And therefore, it's always the way. It's kind of when one nation does something, and if Germany does it, then other nations will go, well, we're not happy with this edict, so we're going to propose breaking this regulation, these rules, and then all hell breaks loose in the European Union. Just, of course, implodes on that basis. So it's kind of ironic again that the virus is proving to be another accelerant, this time in the ultimate destruction of the European Union as we know it, because Germany might now just end up being the catalyst that causes it all to fall apart, when it was more obvious that it would have been Italy was an obvious candidate, not exclusively, but for economic reasons, it's the third biggest economy in the European Union. And also we know all the political, angst that exists in the country, where a lot of people have had enough of the European Union. They want to leave. They're not keen on having the euro anymore. And that's something that's been going on for a number of years. Okay, Salvini didn't succeed and he kind of got pushed sideways a little bit, but there's an undercurrent in the people. And I think, ironically, the coronavirus made the Italian people turn around and go, you did nothing for us. It was China and Russia and the Cubans, ironically, were the people who came to our aid. That you did nothing. So it's kind of further cementing in a lot of Italian people's minds that the European Union's useless. And it's supposed to be this union. And when it was supposed to be a union, its whole approach to handling the coronavirus just fell apart. Every nation, it was, ran to their own to deal with their own requirements and forgot they were a union and needed a centralized policy, not least in the Schengen policy, whereby it's all open borders within Europe and you can travel freely. I mean, that's just one of the immediate problems that needed some cohesive approach in how you would handle that, and they just didn't handle anything. And it shows ultimately, despite all this idea, it's this wonderful, happy union, all these nations, when push comes to pull, will try to do what's best for them, because ultimately it's not the union that the Soroses of this world ever envisaged. And that's the one thing they sorely underestimated. You could push nations so far, but when you push them to the point, as they did with Germany, then really enough is enough. And the German Constitutional Court proved that very, very succinctly.
You know what's fascinating over the last 12 months, approximately 12 months or so, we've seen rejections of those who've been appointed in positions of power by the cabal. Theresa May, her and her husband, they're tied seriously to the financial centers of the deep state. She was kicked out of, she was forced out of there for her ineptitude. We have Macron. Macron has popularity numbers lower than Francois Hollande. It takes an idiot to be worse than Francois Hollande. I'm sorry. And who was Macron? He was a banker for the Rothschild Bank who just was put in there, came out of nowhere, boom. Then, of course, we have Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, the Iron Lady of the 21st century, who all of a sudden, in a very, very short amount of time, suddenly was thrown to the wolves. And I don't even know why she's bothering to stay in office. Ego or whatever. But she's now virtually toothless. Then you have where Mario Draghi could murder people in the streets and then throw out helicopter money in the same day, and everybody in Europe was okay with him doing it. The second Lagarde comes in, who has been long-standing a deep state player, incompetent player. She comes in, and now all of a sudden they're standing up to her at the ECB. It's fascinating how all these things have happened within the last 12 months. We have what you just mentioned in Italy. Salvini was the deputy prime minister, I believe. He got, pushed aside out of office, but he's sitting on the sidelines and allowing just the rest of Italy, which is tied to this EU in Brussels, watching them just fall upon themselves with incompetency. And he's waiting in the wings, and he's going to make a resurgence when the people suddenly say, okay. And Salvini was smart. Boy, he got out of this before this whole crap came about, so he's pretty much scot-free. You're seeing this, all across the board. The EU, which was never, ever, ever supposed to be a political union, it was never supposed to be one where Brussels dominated. As the German court said, the EU is supposed to have powers deferred to it. It's not supposed to have powers that are above sovereign states. And when that came out, and the reaction by the EU and the EU courts in regards to this, everybody knew it. And I think sovereign leaders and governments within the sovereign states suddenly are saying, you know what? We are either going to have to stand up and bring about dissolution of this whole thing now. Otherwise, we are going to be, just co-opted and no longer have any sovereign power. What stands out to me, too, is the fact that NATO has pretty much done nothing in regards to the Greek-Turkey issue. They're both NATO members, but NATO has been absolutely silent. If NATO was smart, they'd come in, they'd put, they'd do what they did in the past. They'd put NATO troops in between Turkey and Greece and let the whole thing then just sort of fall apart. But they've done nothing, which tells you how toothless NATO now is. The whole thing with Europe, the whole thing with the euro, the whole thing with the dollar, all they are biding time. And I think they're doing their last-ditch effort. As one story came out, during the lockdown, billionaires made $412 million or $1 billion or whatever in profits. It's a last-ditch effort to siphon money out of the economies of the West into the hands of the few, in the hopes that they will be the ones who will be dominant and rule in the new system. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
if the dollar is not involved in this new system, their wealth is meaningless.
Well, yeah, and that's the stupid part they fail to understand. They can accumulate trillions of dollars if they like, but they don't understand the dollar will be persona non grata. So they can, I suppose what they can do is they can get their roaring open fires in the winter and burn them all to keep warm. And because that's about how much value and worth it will have. So yeah, but that's that level of ignorance of the fact that they don't understand what's happening. They still think China's a provincial backwater. They think Russia's is a bankrupt nation. They still think it's like the Soviet era, and of course it's not. And yeah, no one's saying Russia's still got a lot of ground to cover and a lot of important decisions to make in the future in terms of how it handles things, not in terms of necessarily economically, but its integration into the West, and which it's going to have to. It's going to have to make some changes to its legal framework, and there are challenges ahead, but the future is coming from the East, and it's not dominated by any nation, but but they still don't understand, because of course, for many of them, the belief in the dollar is on a level that would stagger people. They'll never refuse. They'll always, refuse to accept that the dollar's days are numbered. Even when the Fed's printing trillions, because a lot of them go, oh, it's all deflationary. It's never going to cause inflationary problems. It'll all be contained. We did it since 2008. What, of course, they don't realize is that what they're doing now, compared to what they did in the previous decade, is significantly greater, and they've done it in a matter of weeks, and they've only just started because there's no end to this now. But it is. So yeah, they can make all the money dollars they like, but in the end, it'll be worthless. And to be honest, as much as some of them might be making money, the one thing is a lot of billionaires are just paper billionaires. When it comes to reality, they're not actually billionaires. And the other thing is there are quite a lot of significantly, be careful how I say this, affluent individuals. I'm always tempted to say affluent, but affluent individuals who actually have lost a significant amount of money as a result of what's happened also. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts, but projecting the idea they're making all this enormous sums of money is part of this reasoning that there's this great plan and they're creaming all the money out of the system. Well, I'm sure there was some idea they could do that back in Weimar Germany days. Well, look how that worked out for them. The only good thing is, from everyone's perspective, is they haven't got the gumption to realize that they need to invest in real money, and they probably never will. So we should be grateful for that, at least.
Yeah, holding paper wealth gives you one benefit above almost everybody else. It gives you access to the credit. Period.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just truly amazing to watch how disconnected from reality things are as we continue to get news here in the stateside in regards to companies closing, shuttering operations altogether. But yet we witness, and I know we've had this discussion plenty of times, the headline at CNN is that the Dow soars 700 points as optimism comes up for a coronavirus vaccine. So that just shows you, again, just the amount of information that's coming out and how people perceive things. And but there's no stopping this. I think that you guys can chime in terms of watching, observing this complete shift that's occurring. It's being played out, but it's going to be, again, how how do people get back to the jobs of work when the employers simply are shutting operations and shutting down? There will be no V effect type recovery to this economy.
I think you're asking the wrong question, CJ, because as change occurs, you can't go back to the way it was. And unless the people realize that we are in a paradigm shift and start looking to the future and what the new paradigm is going to be, then, it goes back to my favorite old axiom. The learners will inherit the earth, and the learned will find themselves completely capable of living in a world that no longer exists. Okay? The paradigm is shifting. Education, the way education is going to be done is shifting. The way that states and municipalities earn revenue from taxes is going to be shifting. The way that commercial property is going to be shifting. The way that people work more from home and they can work anywhere in the world, et cetera, et cetera. The way supply chains are going to be reshifted and redone. Trying to hope to go back to the old way is just not going to happen. And unfortunately, the days of potential prepping for the new paradigm are over. We're in the middle of the shift. And there's going to be survivors, and there's going to be those that don't survive. And it's harsh and it's sad to say, and it's not that we don't have empathy for it, but this is the way it's happened throughout history, cyclically, all the time. Every few decades, every few hundred years, this is what happens.
Well, do you know what's interesting with regards to that? The Chinese Foreign Ministry came out with a statement at the weekend. It's quite often the Chinese come out with the most interesting comments at weekends. Maybe it's because the West doesn't hear them say, I don't know. But they came out at the weekend and said that this is a once in a century change. So what they're basically telling the world is, we're in the middle of a paradigm shift. We're telling you this, but I mean, most people in the West won't listen to anything China says anyway, or won't understand the context of it. That's precisely what they're alluding to. And China's making all these changes. They're rotating their economy. They're moving to the new tech sector, whether people like it or don't like it. They're investing enormous sums of money. They're buying up assets. They're getting rid of as many dollars as they can. They've actually accumulated far more than anyone ever realizes, and they're trying to clean up their shadow banking sector. They trimmed 16 trillion euros, which is about $2 trillion from shadow banking sector, to try and clean it up, because they're preparing for what's coming. The big difference between the West is the West desperate to hang on to everything, to protect any asset. The Fed will buy everything and anything to stop it going to the wall, or if something files for bankruptcy, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, they'll do everything to try and keep it afloat. The big difference is China's getting everything and going, no, you're useless. Sorry, we're not going to keep you afloat. You're just going to go. Yes, there's going to be short-term unemployment problems. Yes, there's going to be businesses going to the wall. Yes, there are certain banks that will end up not surviving, but we don't care, because this is attrition and this is what's going to happen in this paradigm shift. Whereas the West is desperately trying to hang on to anything and everything to keep the nightmare alive that they're trying to sell as a dream. And unfortunately, it's going to cause enormous problems for people, because they desperately want to hang on as well to that. Now, that's understandable in one sense, because you work for a company X now. You want to hope that you're going to go back and work for company X, but they don't realize that it's quite possible company X won't even exist in 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months, or into the foreseeable future, because there is that big shift. And that's the difference. The West doesn't understand what's coming in the main, but you can certainly say the Chinese understand what's coming, and the Chinese people are understanding what's coming. And that's the big difference, and that's the big problem that we're going to have in the West compared to what they have. And we're not saying it's plain sailing. China is going to have problems and challenges. Let's not suggest to the contrary. But at least they're making preparation, and have been for 20 years. China and Russia. Putin's done it for 20 years. China started to realize where they had to be, what they had to do in the future. And they formulated plans 20 years ago, and they've methodically worked through them. The same with Russia through Putin. That is the big difference. And that's why it's easier for them to make this transition to where the future is, as opposed to Western nations who are still scrapping, trying to preserve the unpreservable.
Ken, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, just as Paul said, a century ago, if you think about it, at the end of World War I, around 1919, 1920, the age of empires ended. The age of nation states rose. And despite the fact that we had the Soviet Union for 70 years, the Chinese Revolution, what we had in Bosnia, what we had all over the world in different things, by the time the 21st century came, and even now, the map looks almost exactly like it did by 1926, 1930, the age of nation states. It seems like even with the European Union starting to fall, the U.S. hegemony starting to fall, this move every 100 years to go back to sovereign and nationalism, looking out for yourself while trying to make small agreements with your partners, that is coming into bear. And those who, it's going to be a massive transition, because we've had a global financial system, a global banking system. I think that's going to go by the wayside. Bilateral trade, use of a singular polar reserve, i.e. gold, silver, or whatever resource is going to see a return, and the hegemonic powers of empire are going to be completely fall into the wayside. How long that's going to last here going into the future of the 21st century, nobody can know. Everything does in a cycle. But judging by what has happened in the past 100 years ago, and it's mentioned that China is recognizing it, America is not, or maybe those in America who are trying to prepare for it are. Either way, the pendulum has definitely shifted more to the Eurasian, Asian side of the map, and you can either fight it and get completely trounced, or you can accept what is coming, prepare for it, and be a part of it.
Yeah, and if the US is part of it, it can be a great nation amongst equals. And do you know what? The whole world would really appreciate seeing that. And I know from people I've known in Russia and China, and they're all desperate for a US who's like that, because they know the benefits it will be not just the American people, but the world in general. So let's hope that happens sooner rather than later, because it'd be great for the American people, but it'd also be of great benefit to the world. Because if you harness the best skills and the best attributes of nations, and nations come together, imagine what they could achieve. Who knows?
Yep. Very well said. Gentlemen, thank you for a great discussion today. And for our Gadfly subscribers, again, thank you for supporting our multi-channel network. Please comment directly on this video or jump over to the forums. We appreciate your support. So Paul and Ken, thank you so much for a great discussion today.
Thanks, CJ. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, and thanks for everyone and all your support, which we greatly appreciate.